Hi, I'm Brandon Donaldson, and have you wanted to debug, build, and deploy a Flutter web app and host it on App Engine? Well, you've come to the right place. Today I'm going to cover just that, how to build, debug, and deploy a Flutter web app to App Engine. So let's get started. First off, I just want to mention that I've got the source code on GitHub, and if you want to link to it, you'll find that in the video description below. And what I wanted to cover is real quick is I want to go to the initialization section of the GitHub repo README. And if you look down towards the bottom, I have an init reference, and I talk about installing the Dart tools. I don't cover this in this video, and generating the Flutter web application and installing the cloud tools for GCP or App Engine. Okay, so let's get started with the project demonstration. Okay, so I've got VS Code open and I can see all the files and directories on the left here. I have three main sections: the client, the server, and the build system, which I use Travis to deploy the application. And I'll cover all these files and resources in the order of server, client, and then to build, deploy, and we'll look at how all that works together. Okay, first off, the server. The server is a Dart HTTP web server. I've got it all wired up and ready to go. So let's take a look at how that is wired up. I'm going to look at the pubsec.yaml. I have one dependency, and that's the MIME type, and I'll show you where that's implemented in a minute. I also have a lib directory, and it has one server.dart. Now I have a video just on the Dart web server, and I won't cover all the nitty-gritty here, but I'll cover it at a high level. If I look at the main section, the main entry point, it starts up the HTTP web server in a way of it looks and awaits for the requests that come from the server, and it handles those requests. Okay, so I've got an HTTP server listening for requests. Then how does it handle those requests? Well, if I look at the requests, I have two paths. One for /API. So in this directory or this path, I dynamically generate some JSON. I also have a handle static files request for everything other than the /API requests. And I'll show this in the web browser in a minute. So if I look at the handle API request, I come down and I pass the request object into this method. And I look at the conditional statements I've set up where the URI path or URL is /API. I'll respond with a request or response in the request, and I'll set the header type of HTML, and I'll just print out something simple. Hey, this works. Try API /get message. Okay, so get message is basically a response with a content type of JSON. And by the way, if you look here, I add a CORS header which says access control allow origin wildcard. And the second piece to that is access control allow methods post-get, basically all the verbs. And I allow all the requests that come cross domain, and I'll show you where that's coming from in a minute when I get to the Flutter web app. I'll write back a simple JSON string with a message saying the board is green. Okay, so that was really simple. And everything else that follows under API that doesn't have a path here will respond with a 404. Okay, so then onto the static files request. So I have normalization here. So I just peel off the /. And then I say everything that contains a period. I know everything that doesn't contain a period, then I need to add the index.html to it. So if it was /API, if it was here, or if it was /files, I'm going to add an index.html. So that's just the wildcard. For everything else, I look at the HTML path, and then I resolve that to the absolute file path on the system, and I look to see if it was found. If it was, then I read that resource or file, and I respond with its MIME type, and write it and pipe it back to the response. If it wasn't found, I'll respond with a 404. So that was pretty simple. Okay, so that's the server. Now I have an HTML directory for static resources. And if I look at the index.html, it's temp file that will be replaced. And when I wire up the Flutter web app, I'm going to copy the resources into this HTML directory. But in this case, since the server and client are disconnected, and I'll show this more in a minute when I debug both of them together, I build this and put it in the dist directory, which you can see here I've built in an earlier session when I was testing. You can see the HTML, I have the Flutter web app. Okay, I'll get back to that more in a minute. Okay, so onto the server. How would I debug the server? There's two routines I can debug the server with. One is with VS Code and two is with the command line. The first one I want to do is with the command line. So I'm going to go into the server directory by right-clicking and going open in terminal. Once it opens, then I can run Dart. Because I've installed the Dart CLI tools, so I'll go Dart lib server.dart. Okay, this will start up this web server, and it's going to be listening for localhost 8080 API and so forth. So I'm going to command click and open it up. Okay, great. The temp file that will be replaced, the same thing I just showed moments ago. Okay, so let's try the other endpoints just to make sure they work. Okay, so API works, that's great. And API responds with a JSON object or string. So that's fantastic. Everything works on the Dart web server. So it's really easy to set up a Dart web server. I'm going to stop this process. So I've run the server in the terminal. Now I want to run it in VS Code and debug it with breakpoints. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the run context, and I want to run the server. So I've already created some launchers, and so what I'll do is go to the launch configurations by hitting on the gear, and I have one launcher for starting the server. I have one launcher for starting the Flutter web app in development mode. I also have another launcher for the Flutter web app, but it's for production. You can see the difference in the program. The entry point is set to main dev or just main.dart. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on the server. So I'm going to go to one. I'm going to run the Dart web server. Okay, it's the exact same method that happened when I ran it in the terminal. So that's pretty cool. So let's start that up and load it in the web page. Okay, great. I have a temp file that is replaced. Now, one thing I didn't add to this tutorial is a Chrome launcher. I'll cover that in another episode. Keep your eyes peeled. Okay, so now that I can run it, let's see if I can breakpoint on it. So I'll go to a resource. I'm going to go to the server lib directory and server.dart. So I want to listen for a request that goes to the API path. And so let's find that path. And so I'll just add a breakpoint to the if statement or conditional. That's on line 44 there. Okay, so I'm going to need to reload the page, but with API. So I'll add API, hit enter. And voila, it has paused on my breakpoint. So that's perfect. Now I can inspect. If I go to the run context, I can see the variables and the call stack. So that's pretty cool. That's a nifty way to debug. So that is the server debugging, both for the terminal and in VS Code. So I'm going to stop this process and go on to the client side. Okay, so on to the client side. The client is basically my Flutter web application. It is a Flutter application in general, which could be compiled and generate an Android or iOS application as well. But in this video, I'm going to concentrate on the web generation. So I've enabled the web tools for Flutter. So I'm going to go into client, and I name my client app. So I'm going to go to pubsec.yaml, which is the instructions for the system. And I can see the name of the application was client. So I just generated the app and named it client. I think that's pretty clear by now. Okay, so I have a Flutter web project. It's a basic, simple project that I generated, and I changed a couple things. So you can generate this. This is bare bones. I won't go into this in great detail today because I'll concentrate on the web pieces. Okay, so it's a simple project. Let me go to the lib directory and load up main.dart. Well, I did include one library, and that's the flavor config library. And this allows me to provide different attributes for the application's entry point and pass that to the application when it's instantiated or initialized. This allows me to have two different endpoints, one for development and one for production. Now, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, and I'm going to concentrate on this just for an example of how to differentiate your development environment versus your production environment, or maybe even staging as well. Okay, so for production, I'm pointing to my Donaldson-sandbox-flex appspot.com. So I've created a project on App Engine, and I called it Donaldson Sandbox Flex. And when I generated it, I generated a Flex project. It's important to note that you have to generate a Flex project. Okay, so I'm going to go to the main.dev, or main_dev, and I have localhost 8080. So this allows me to debug locally and send it a different attribute, a base URL. Okay, so this property is passed to main app, and the main app is initialized. It's a stateless widget, or at least the base widget is stateless. And then you come down to the home page, it's a stateful widget. And the one routine I want to concentrate on in here is how I fetch the data. So I have a button in the middle of a page, and when I click on the button, I call fetch server message. Fetch server message references the flavor config, and this allows me to generate the URL, and then I call get URL. I wait for the response. If the response is good, then I decode the JSON, create an object out of it, and then use that to update the state. Okay, so I don't think I need to go over to the Flutter basics in here, but in essence, what I'm doing is doing a simple call to my web server and getting that data and transforming that into something I can use. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Now, how would I debug this? Okay, so I'm in the client. I want to go to the debugging context and look at the launchers. So I'm going to open up the launchers, and I reviewed this a little bit in the server section. I have two launchers, one for dev and one for production. The difference being the entry point, which points to main_dev, which has the flavor config for my URL that points to the local host. Or I could point to production and run against production. And this will point the URL to the production web server, which is basically my sandbox app engine environment. Okay, so I want to start up the environment. So I will start the server first and run that. So I'll start the server, and then I want to run the development environment and hit run. So I'll have two processes running in this VS Code environment. And I can get to the two processes up at the upper right, or the run context or the run toolbar for VS Code for launch server or launch Flutter web application. It takes a moment to start, but once it starts, really fast to refresh and edit the configuration. Okay, great. It's up and running, and I put the browser to the right of VS Code. Okay, so what happens here is if I press on the button, it will run a fetch request to the web server and paint on this paint in the document the board is green. So if I go ahead and click on it, it should work. Okay, the board is green. So the entire system worked from front to back. Now I want to debug the server from front to back from the Flutter web app side all the way to the server and round trip it back. So how would I do that? So I'm going to look at the configuration, or the source code configuration, starting with Flutter. So I'm going to go to my app, which was a simple generated app. Okay, what I want to do is set a breakpoint before it makes a call to the server, and then after it makes a call to the server, I want to set a breakpoint. So where is that? So I see the HTTP request, and it's waiting for that. So after that, I'll set it right here before the response is evaluated. Okay, so after that, I want to set a breakpoint on the server side, and I'll set it right in the path of the API. So it'll handle the API request and break just before it evaluates that as well. Okay, so to analyze this, I want to click on the browser, and I want to click on the button, and it should pause here, pause after the request, and pause on the server. So let's look at that. So I'm going to hit run, and there it is. It paused before it made the call. Let me resume. It paused on the server, so that's great. I can analyze that. Okay, let me resume. Okay, it paused in the Flutter web app after it made the call as well, so I can look at the response in detail. So if I go to the run context, I can see what the variables are and how it's responding. And I can resume. and the board is green. So that's really simple to debug both the front end and the back end, which are both written in Dart. And it just makes for a great debugging experience for building web applications. Okay, so now that I've built, I want to move to building it and deploying it to App Engine. Let's see what that looks like next. Okay, I'm ready to build and deploy my application. So how would I do that? The very first thing I want to cover is my build.sh. Now in this file, I include the instructions on how to build and glue the web server and Flutter web app together. Okay, so what do I do in this file? At the very beginning, I clean the dist directory, which is a directory I create and put all of the contents and resources that I'm getting ready to publish. And I'll show you why and how that all goes together here in a moment. Okay, so the very first operation I do is cd into the server directory, and then I run pub get. Well, in this sequence of events, I don't really need this step, but I do it anyways. I use this more for the Elastic Beanstalk config, and I'll show you why in a minute when I get to the Docker file. Okay, so then I build the client, and this is important. I cd into the client, I run flutter pubget to get the dependencies, and then I run flutter build web app. After that, I glue all the pieces together. I take the server and copy it to the dist directory, and this is at the root of the dist directory. And then I go into the Flutter web app and copy all the resources into the HTML resources or static resources directory. Once that's complete, I can debug it and just make sure I've wired it up correctly. So let's take a look at how I would do that. So if I open up and go open in terminal, and I can debug this just like I did in VS Code. So I can go Dart, and since I'm in this directory, I can go lib and server.dart. If all goes well, it will work perfectly. Okay, so I'm going to load it up in a browser. And I can see it loaded the web application. And you can see I'm running on localhost 8080, but now it's using the main entry point. So if I clicked on main and I haven't deployed it, it wouldn't work. So let me just click on that. Well, the board is green. And that's because I've already deployed my application to the endpoint, so I can see that it's returning JSON from the production environment. So that's good. But the very first time, you'll see that you'll get a 404 for this request for that. And you can see that in the dev tools. Okay, back to this. I'm going to go Control C to end that process. Okay, now I'm ready to deploy it. So how would I deploy my web application to App Engine, the Flex environment? Okay, so I'm going to minimize dist and look at the travis.yaml configuration. And I use this CI service to deploy my web application because they make it really simple. Okay, so how would I do this? So it's a YAML configuration, and they have an environment which you can set as Dart, which is great because that makes things easy. So I'm going to have a Dart environment to build my application and run in. And so before I get everything going, I basically take my key, and you can see my key over here. And this is the secrets. This is the Google secrets of how I can authenticate and deploy to my App Engine environment. And I won't cover that, but I have some links to get to that under authentication, getting started, Cloud Console, generate the secret key. That's how you get your key. Okay, so I got the key, I downloaded it, and what I set in the git ignore, make sure I don't commit that, but I will commit the encrypted key because when it is encrypted, I can decrypt it in the Travis CI environment. So that makes it really easy. Before everything is set up and running, I need to clone Flutter, and I'm going to use the beta branch. I'm going to export the path so I can run the Flutter commands. I upgrade, config, to the same instructions that are on the website. After that, I run my build.sh, which is great because I have the same environment configuration locally, and then I have some debugging. Then I remove the orphans. I no longer need the client server and Flutter directory because everything is in the dist directory. Okay, so then I deploy. I use the Google App Engine configuration for Travis. I use my secret key, which is decoded or unencrypted, and then I point to the project I created. Okay, so that's neat and nifty in how I deploy, but there's one more configuration piece to this puzzle, and that is the Docker environment that App Engine Flex uses. So let's look at that. There's two pieces that I have for debugging that environment. And that is my script, which I debug docker container config. I build the Docker container and then I run it, and then I just output what is running in the Docker container. Okay, so that's how I build it, but what is the Docker container? The Docker file are the instructions to build the Docker container, which I'll run on Flex. Okay, so in this container, I run a Google Dart image, and I set the working directory to /app. So the app directory is now like I'm changing into that directory. Okay, so now that I'm in the app directory, I want to add the resources to that directory. And so I take my dist, the dist source, I take the pubsec, and I follow the instructions in the Google Dart image for Docker. So these same instructions can be found there. So if you need the nitty gritty, go to this link here, hub.docker.com, r Google and Dart. So I get the dependencies. I add the dist to the app directory, then I pub-get offline, which wires up the packages in this environment. I set the entry point to run the program Dart with the entry point of server.dart. Okay, so this is the same instructions I did locally in my terminal. At the end of the instructions, I set expose port 8080, which the Flex environment uses. Okay, so this is pretty easy, but if I wanted to debug and test this, how would I do it? So I'm going to go to my debug. By the way, I'm just going to note, every time I change the Docker file, I iterate the version. That's just my technique of making sure everything runs correctly. So you can see I've ran it about 12 times for this tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to open up the terminal in this directory so I can run this command. So I'll go sh debug and the container.sh. So it will build the image and run the container. So you can see it ran docker ps, which lists the container that's running for Docker, and it has the container ID and name. So I'm just going to go docker ps just for good measure, and you can see it's the exact same thing. And you can see the entry point. So if I were to load up a web page on 8080, it should be working correctly, because you can see that it's listening on all the IPs for 8080 and pointing to the hosted container, which is on 8080 as well. Okay, so let's just go to a browser and do that. Let's close the previous sessions just to make sure it's all good. So I'll go HTTP localhost 8080, and it works. So if I press on try local API request, this is going to send the request to the production environment. Okay, so the board is green. It works. Now, it wouldn't work the very first time because the endpoint wouldn't have been hosted yet. Okay, so that's great. Everything works. I know it's working, so now I want to stop the Docker container, so I could go Docker. Stop nifty fiestel, which is the name of the container. I could use the ID or name in these operations or arguments for Docker. So now that I know my Docker container runs great and it listens on 8080, if it didn't, I need to correct that, but I don't have to in this video. I can deploy it using Travis CI. So how would I do that step? How do I get it to Travis? Well, all I have to do is run the commit, push it up to GitHub, and Travis is listening to say, okay, there's a change. I'm going to run the build based on these instructions here and deploy it to App Engine. Okay, so let's do that. I want to show that real quick, and then we'll wrap up the video. Okay, so what I want to do is commit the code that I've changed. So I've made a few modifications while editing this during my tutorial. So I'm going to go update tutorial and commit it. So I'm on the master branch for this tutorial. So I'll just push it up with git lens and go to Git or go to Travis. Okay, so the build has started. It was listening for the changes, and you can see the operation is in motion. Okay, so it has deployed to App Engine. So one thing to note about App Engine, if you don't have Travis configured to roll the instance, you need to get on to App Engine and roll it. And the way you do that is with split traffic. I won't cover that in great detail. That menu is kind of hidden in this width of the browser, but you can go up and click split traffic and change it to 100%. So you can see I've already changed it to 100%. And what I want to do is now load up the application and see if it's working. So I have the application saved in my clipboard, so I'm going to paste it in and hit run and load it up. Okay, so the application is loading. And this application, just a note, if something goes haywire, load up your dev tools and delete the cache or delete the application cache, because it's a progressive web app. It's going to have a service worker. It's going to cache the assets. So if you have some URLs that change, you may need to invalidate and evict the cache. Okay, so I'm going to click on Try Local API Request. And the board is green. It has made a request to the Dart web server on App Engine, so it is fully working. So this is one of my favorite web application experiences so far. I've had a lot of fun building this tutorial. I hope you enjoy it, and check out the source code and let me know. Give me some feedback in the description below. If you have questions, let me know. I'll see what I can do to help you out. And overall, thanks for watching today. Follow me for more tips and tricks on debugging, and I'll catch you later.